Thank you all for joining the third Domestic Extremism and Mass Violence Task Force meeting. Thank you to our task force members and the members of the public who are joining us today. My name is Jamie Tugendberg. I'm a policy analyst with the AGO, and I staff the task force. I'm joined by several of my colleagues here today who will be making sure our webinar meeting will be running smoothly. Manveer is logged in as AGO staff to help out with any tech needs, including if anyone's struggling to get on the webinar. Hopefully it'll go smoother than last meeting. And then we also have Osvaldo and Kelly joining in the room for any of the members in public who have come in person today to watch. Today and moving forward, our meetings are going to be live streamed and recorded on TVW to make our meetings more accessible. I really want to appreciate TVW for that partnership. We are still using webinar settings, meaning that only task force members, staff, presenters, and panelists will be enabled to use their microphone and camera. We ask that task force members, when we get to Q&A, you can either raise your hand like this or use the raised hand function on Zoom to facilitate your questions. And then just a reminder, we will not be answering any questions from the members of the public who may have joined in attendance today. Before we go through the agenda, I'm going to begin with just introductions one last time, knowing that we have such a large group. I'm going to be going in alphabetical order by first name. So as I call on you, please just state your name and the organization that you represent. And as people trickle in, I will kind of go back through the list so that we can get everyone introduced. And then at the end, we also have some presenters from the National Mass Violence Center joining us, so I'll also have them introduce themselves as well. But I'm going to start with Adriana. Oh, it looks like you're on mute, Adriana.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adriana Suluai. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as the policy director for Utopia, Washington.
Thank you, Adriana. Amber.
Good morning, everyone. Amber Nguyen. I'm with the Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Thank you, Amber. Amy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Gillespie, and I am with Pierce County Emergency Management.
Thank you, Amy. Hardeep.
Hi, I'm Hardeep Rekhi. I'm with Khalsa Government Center.
Thank you, Hardeep. Jay.
Hello, I'm Jay Garrison. I'm with Washington Immigrant Defense Network.
Thank you, Jay. And everyone's moving around my screen a little bit, so give me a moment. Just want to make sure I don't miss anyone. Kate, I know you joined just right now, so we're just doing introductions, name, and organization, and you're
next. Kate Bitts, Western State Center Senior Organizer.
Thank you, Kate. Kira?
Hi, my name's Kira Kazanjian, and I'm with Jewish Family Service.
Thank you, Kira. Leslie?
Leslie Cushman, Washington Coalition for Police Accountability.
Thank you, Leslie. Mark?
Mark Kreider, Walla Walla County Sheriff.
Mark. I'm just making sure I'm not missing anyone again. Mercedes?
Hi, Mercedes Sanchez with Cedar River Clinics.
And Roger?
Roger Cluck with Projects for Civil Society and the Alternatives to Violence Project.
Sharon?
Hi, good morning. Sharon Navas, Equity and Education Center, she, her.
Stacy?
Stacey McLean with Washington State Emergency Management.
And Rick?
Rick Bishop, Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs.
And Nathan, and I recognize I'm going out of order because I jumped the list.
It's okay. Nate Weed, Washington State Department of Health, Chief of Resiliency and Health Security.
Thank you. I think I've gotten all of the task force members that have logged on at this time. So Seth, I'm sorry, Seth.
No worries, and I see Cynthia here too. Seth Limmer, I'm from Peril, the Polarization, Extremism, Research and Innovation Lab in DC.
Thank you, Seth. And we had 2 more task force members join, so I'm going to put them on the spot really quickly. We're doing introductions, just name and the organization that you represent. So I'm going to start with Faulina.
Lua Pritchard, Executive Director of Asia Pacific Culture Center.
And then Miri.
Hi, sorry for running late. I'm Miri Barr-Halperin. I'm the Director of Trauma Services and Training at Parents for Peace.
Thank you, Miri. Liz, I also saw you just joined. We're doing introductions. It's just name and organization.
Good morning, Liz Moore, Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane. Happy to be with you all.
Thank you. And I also saw Auditor Hall has joined us. Mary, we'll have you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mary Hall, Thurston County Auditor.
Okay. I'm going to take one moment before I say I've introduced all the task force members this time, but I think I've gotten everyone. So I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia, who is contracted to help with the task force, and then I'll have our presenters from the National Mass Violence Center introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Miller-Idris. I'm a professor and the director at the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab.
Thank you, Cynthia. And then we will have Elizabeth.
Me?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Cronin. I'm the Associate Academic Program Director at the National Mass Violence Center, which is located at the Medical University of South Carolina.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Jamison?
Yes, good morning. It's good afternoon for me. Hope you guys are doing well. My name is Jamison Bottomley. I am a clinical psychologist. I am a colleague of Elizabeth's at the National Mass Violence Center at Medical University of South Carolina, where I work primarily on the response side of things, but also on the research team as well, which is part of the highlight of today's talk. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jamison. And then Sarah, I saw you have joined. We're just doing a quick round of introductions, name and the organization that you represent.
Hi, Sarah Huffman. Oh, I'm
two...
sorry, not me.
No, you're good. We'll have Sarah Huffman. We'll have you introduce yourself next.
There's always multiple Sarahs. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Walker. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Washington, and I'm a psychologist by training. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Sarah Huffman. Sorry about that.
Hey, Sarah's a great name. Hi, Sarah Huffman. I'm a coordinator with the National Mass Violence Center, and I work with Jamison and Elizabeth.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. And again, welcome to the members of the public who are joining us online or in person at our Seattle office today. Now we're going to go through the agenda. First, we're going to review the January meeting minutes, which were sent out in advance, and document the written comments that we received prior to today's meeting. Then we will hear from Elizabeth and Jamison from the National Mass Violence Center before having a short break. After the break, we will have 2 short presentations, one from myself and then from Roger with Projects for Civil Society, before we close the meeting discussing next steps. I just want to acknowledge, the nature of this topic is heavy, and there's a lot of uncertainty and fear in our communities at this time. So I just want to say, we understand that if members or members of the public, need to take a moment and a break and take a few minutes, we just ask that, especially our task force members, you commit to coming back and being present when you are able to. Any questions about today's agenda? Are we ready to adopt the agenda? Do I have a motion? I see Seth. Do you mind coming off mute to maybe make that motion?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to the meeting minutes, which were sent out in advance, and they are posted on the AGO's website. Are there any comments or suggestions or revisions to the meeting minutes from January? Are there any motions to approve the meeting minutes from January?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking about our public comment. The task force is a forum for discussing an important public policy issue and develop thoughtful and meaningful recommendations. As such, we expect all participants, meaning members, staff, presenters, and the public, to engage in good faith and not direct targeted comments to other members, the public, or staff. As staff, we will not be tolerating those comments in these meetings. Since last meeting, staff have changed public comment protocols to expand the ways that the public has opportunities to provide their thoughts on items that are under discussion during our task force meetings, and ensure that task force meetings can be effective and productive so that this group can meet its legislatively required mandate. This new protocol increases the amount of time that people are able to submit their comments, and with written comment, we do not have to limit people's time. The period for members to submit their written comment on items of the agenda opened after the materials were posted to the website this Monday, March 10th, and they will close a week from now, so March 21st, to allow for the members who are joining here in attendance or who may watch the recording on TVW in the next week to be able to provide comment on today's meeting. Comments that were received by 5 p.m. last night were distributed to the task force members prior to the meeting. In total, we received 5 written comments as of 5 p.m. last night, and staff will distribute any additional comments we receive after the portal closes next Friday. So for those of the members who are in attendance today and would like to provide comment, there is still opportunities to. Just visit our website and there's information on how you can submit that written comment. And I'm also encouraging those who have already submitted a comment maybe before this meeting, you will have an opportunity to submit one again. So now before I turn the floor over to Jamison and Elizabeth, I just want to remind the group of the goals of this task force, which are to create recommendations for a public health and community-based approach to address extremism and mass violence here in Washington State. This framework emphasizes prevention, and it is an alternative to surveillance, censorship, and incarceration. This task force does not and will not designate individuals or communities or groups as extremists, nor will it be investigating incidents that may occur in our communities while we convene. This group recognizes the immediate and rippling harm that designations of extremism can have. The proviso also that created this group constrains this group from seeking to make any recommendations that would increase criminal penalties, criminal law enforcement, or change criminal law. We recognize this is an extremely sensitive topic, and we're working on this issue again during a period of time that many people in our communities are experiencing fear and instability. Our task force strives to be transparent, and we do really value hearing concerns from members of the public. So I would now like to turn the floor over to Jamison and Elizabeth, who will be providing a presentation to help us better understand mass violence. The floor is yours, and let me know if you have any issues sharing your screen.
Oh, looks like Jamison's got it.
Perfect.
So thank you everyone for having us here. Prior to my role at the National Mass Violence Center, I was the director of the New York State Office of Victim Services. And in that role, I had the dubious distinction of having had to respond to a number of mass violence incidents in the state of New York, each one being extremely unique and having, very specific challenges to the region and as a result of the type of crime it was. So, for example, we responded to Buffalo, the top shooting in 2022, which was a hate crime, which left our community devastated in a way that other communities who were not targeted because of who they are was. So I love this group. I think having a multidisciplinary and a public health approach is absolutely the way to go, both with mass violence and community violence in general. And I think it's due time, that we all are talking about this issue. It's something that's been happening for quite a long time, and not enough communities are facing it in a way that brings real ideas and real results. So thank you so much for having us. So we're going to talk about mental health impact. I was a special victims prosecutor for 14 years. So I saw a lot of the consequences of violent crime against victims, and now in my prior role and now here, I'm seeing the impact on the mental health of entire communities as a result of extremism and mass violence. So I'm thrilled that we're here, and Jamison will be covering a lot of the mental health issues, because although I have experience in dealing with it, that is not my area of expertise. So we are funded through the Office of Victims of Crime, which is an agency under the Department of Justice. And through the work that we've been doing since 2017, our psychologists, because most of the folks that work with us are clinical psychologists, so they have a lot of experience in doing research. And I think it's one of the reasons that the Medical University of South Carolina was selected, is because of their ability to do really in-depth research on trauma and crime and victims. So a lot of what has come out, a lot of the work that has come out of our organization is as a result of working with communities that have been directly impacted by mass violence. Next. So what we're going to talk about today is really giving you sort of an overview of who we are and what we are. And Jamison's going to talk about the that's not going to be my word today, surveys that were conducted by the National Mass Violence Center on PTSD and depression, because I think a lot of us draw conclusions as to what we think would be the consequences of extremism and mass violence. And that's
Elizabeth, sorry to just stop you.
Yeah.
Jamison, are you able to change the screen so that we can see the full slides? Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
So, as I said, we have assumptions that we draw about how we think communities will respond. And every community is unique. Every individual is unique. And so we have to look at, if there's commonalities, and then how we can work with those communities. If what we see is sort of common to a lot of these events, and help formulate responses in the aftermath. So we're going to talk, Jamison works primarily on the response side. I work primarily on the preparedness side. So how do we help communities? And you've got everybody together already that would likely be involved in a mass violence incident, both preparation and response. So you're already ahead of the game. And then we'll talk about some lessons learned. So as I indicated, we initially got a cooperative agreement with the federal government to start the Mass Violence Center. And coincidentally, I happened to be a subject matter person who was asked to work with them at the very beginning of this grant about our experiences in New York, because they needed to learn from all of us about what impact it had and why. And so we were doing a lot of some research, a lot of information distribution. But in 2023, when we got our latest iteration of the grant, we added the preparedness division, and we also greatly expanded the response to include actually deploying and going out to communities that had been impacted. We're working with a number of communities directly, such as Lewiston, Maine, and Winder, Georgia, all over the country. And what we want is to, emergency managers, law enforcement, they're always thinking about preparedness. They're always thinking about what do we need to be ready to handle. But a lot of times it doesn't include victim services, trauma, a lot of those issues. And so that's really what our mission is, to make sure that the plans and the response are victim-centered and trauma-informed. And, helping communities understand, like, who do they need to bring in to work with, and, what are the long-term, the short-term, the intermediate-term needs that crime victims and communities as a whole are going to have as a result of a mass violence incident. We don't address all kinds of quote unquote mass violence. There's a lot of different definitions, but we are primarily looking at mass violence events that occur in public that are directed at the public. So we generally don't get involved in domestic violence cases, even though there might be a number of people that were killed or injured. That would not be us, or gang violence in general. Although I will say that we are working with communities that have issues with gang violence, and we've been training and providing technical assistance on developing a mass violence plan that can be utilized in connection with addressing community violence as well. Next. So, as I said, there's no universally accepted definition of mass violence incident. For us, it's sort of when we see something, we'll go to OVC and say, we think this is something that we should be responding to, even though maybe it doesn't meet certain other criteria. And I think it makes it hard for communities that are planning to address it to understand, what definition should they use? How should they be thinking of mass violence in their preparation? And, it isn't always obviously when we read in the news about a mass violence incident that has a lot of deaths, or depending on who the killed or injured are, like school children, that gets a lot of attention, and that's where everybody's focus is directed. But not everything qualifies as mass violence, and sometimes something that you might not think is mass violence. For example, we responded to the shooting at the Super Bowl parade for the Kansas City Chiefs 2 years ago. And there was one person lost their lives, but that was like a public shooting. And once it was determined, I guess it wasn't just a beef or something, that would be something that we would get involved with. The reason that this can be important is because sometimes funding can depend on what the definition is. So, for example, the Office of Victims of Crime has discretionary funding that's available for communities that experience something like this. And, you want to be able to have access to that money, but it has to be a certain kind of event that would qualify for that funding. Next. So OVC defines it as it's an intentional criminal act where, law enforcement is involved that results in all kinds of injuries to a sufficiently large number of people. The beauty of that definition is that it gives us a lot of latitude. And so a lot of these communities really need the support and the resources in the aftermath. And this allows us to get involved in other organizations to get involved in a response. Next. So I'm going to let Jamison take it from here on some of the things that we found through the research.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Okay, good. Yeah, it's great to be with you all today and stepping in for Dr. Moreland, who really spearheaded this with Dr. Kilpatrick as part of our team, some of the research. Really grateful to have a chance to share with you all what we know about the mental health impact of mass violence incidents. And I'll sort of set the stage for our findings of the mental health impact of mass violence among community members by sharing with you all what we know about sort of the impact on direct victims from very specific, concrete mass violence incidents that had occurred in the past that our team had previously investigated. And so just to give you all a sense of sort of the prevalence of exposure to a potentially traumatic event, which would be a mass violence incident, would be one example of that. It's important to note that most individuals at some point in their lifetime will experience a potentially traumatic event. So, for example, possibly a mass violence incident. It's important to note, too, that through decades of research, not just on mass violence incidents, but potentially traumatic events as well, that most individuals that are exposed don't go on to develop things like PTSD and other related disorders, but it's important to note that many do. And so behind that notion is this idea that many will recover naturally on their own, and that's a great thing. But also the high rates of PTSD that we found in our findings, and which I'll go over today, indicate that there are a lot of folks who do need assistance, do need a higher level of care, and that's where a lot of these programs come into play. Sort of a more sobering finding from our prior research is that although there is a substantial proportion of folks that may need care that have PTSD and other related impairing disorders, most of those folks don't actually seek mental health treatment. So there's a really substantial service gap that I think many of us have roles in trying to close to some extent. Also wanted to note here that cumulative exposure over one's life course to potentially traumatic events increases risk for PTSD and related disorders. So, for example, having a history of prior exposure to a potentially traumatic event then places that individual at subsequent risk for PTSD if another potentially traumatic event were to occur. On sort of the good side of things, the good news is that individuals that we know have high levels of social support, they seem to be insulated from some of the negative implications of a mass violence incident in terms of mental health. And we know that from, again, our own research, but also just kind of the more broader traumatic stress field as well. And so really wanting to then zoom in on this particular investigation that focused on 6 communities and why it is we wanted to conduct this research. And a lot of it had to do with wanting to address some of the limitations from prior work that I sort of alluded to, and that, again, with our work with sort of the Pan Am bombing and also 9/11, that focused on direct victims. And so research really hadn't up to this point done a remarkable job understanding the more broader impact of mass violence incidents on individuals that reside in these communities that are affected by a mass violence incident. Also, some of the research was limited by the fact that specific mass violence incidents were investigated and not sort of a constellation or a collection of events and what that impact may have on individuals across communities. Also worth noting too, kind of continuing with some limitations here, that most of the work had been done on international terrorist incidents, such as using bombs and airplanes, for example, with 9/11 and Pan Am, respectively. And we know that most mass violence incidents currently involve mass shootings. And so as a collection of scientists and compassionate others that care about this work, the Mass Violence Center really wanted to get a sense of what the impact was of these more recent kind of contemporary mass violence incidents, namely mass shootings. OVC, it's important to note here too, also recognize that there likely could be some ripple effects on individuals that reside in these MVI affected communities, but again, up to this point, that hadn't really been known. So OVC really sort of tasked us with conducting this type of science to explore this notion empirically. Just what is, to what extent is there a ripple effect, and what might that look like? And so I also, again, want to just make a note here too that, as clinical scientists, we take the stance that in order to gather that information, it's probably most important to go directly to the source. So to go to these communities to get a sense from them, what are their experiences and what's their perspective, and again, that's going to obviously shed light on what resources they may need going forward. And so, like any good science, we had a few hypotheses that drove these investigations, and it sort of ties into what I mentioned earlier, that we knew that exposure to mass violence incidents among direct victims, so what I mean by that is individuals who were maybe at the scene at the time of a mass violence incident or had known somebody that was close to them that was injured or killed, we know that those individuals are at great risk for PTSD and depression. But again, we don't know much about those that are more indirectly affected, those individuals in the community that have been affected by a mass violence incident. So we sort of hypothesized or expected that given rates of PTSD and depression among direct victims, that there may be some sort of role here. There may be some elevated PTSD and depression among these community members just due to simply vicarious exposure. And so that was one of our first kind of aims of this particular study, that was this particular hypothesis. And then also, secondly, we sort of leaning on the 2019 Gallup poll that found that 48% of adults in the U.S. were expressed concern that they or a family member would be a victim of a mass violent shooting. We sort of surmised that it's likely the case that individuals that are residing in these communities that have been affected by a mass violence incident may have higher levels of worry or fear than what is found as among sort of the broader public in the U.S. And so that brings us to these particular surveys that were conducted in 6 MVI-affected communities that included Dayton, Ohio, El Paso, Texas, Parkland, Florida, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, San Bernardino, California, and Virginia Beach, Virginia. And for some of you on the call, this may be familiar. For others, it will not. But I just want to sort of give you a sense of the rigor of the science that we conducted and the sampling methodology. And we used what's called area probability household sampling, which essentially you take a selective area, in this case where these mass violence incidents occurred, and then you randomly select households. And then within those households, you randomly select adults, and we used sort of this basic or this recent birthday method to develop a really large sample of close to 6,000 adults that lived within these or in and around these 6 MVI-affected communities. So specifically 5,991 adults. In terms of data collection, individuals had the option of responding to an assessment through an online method or paper and pencil version they could then mail back to us. And those assessments were offered in English and Spanish just based on preference. The content of the survey of the assessment was really comprehensive, but really for the purpose of today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on just describing what the sample was like, so the demographic characteristics of the sample, and then really getting into some of the more important findings that I think you'll find really staggering. So rates of PTSD and depression, these are presumptive PTSD and depression, because we didn't actually interview anybody clinically, but we sort of followed a very specific kind of algorithm to identify who might meet criteria of PTSD and depression. And then we also looked at kind of going back to that Gallup poll, looking at fears of subsequent violent crime and also subsequent mass violence victimization. And then we also wanted to sort of explore the role of potential risk and protective factors for PTSD and depression, again, based on the prior research that we've conducted, but also from traumatic stress more generally, such that, prior history of potentially traumatic events, and in particular prior victimization, seems to place folks at risk for PTSD and vice versa. Adequate social support seemed to be a buffer. And so we wanted to really test that out. And so that's what I'll be describing today. And so in terms of the sample, I wanted to give you all sort of a snap of what these folks, what sort of background they had. And this was all, again, representative of these 6 distinct mass violence affected communities. But you could see overall, the majority of individuals were identified as female, not Hispanic, Latino, and majority white. And you could see there was some variability in income. And you could see there, for example, about a quarter of participants reported a household income between $25,000 and $50,000, and just over a quarter reported a household income of about $25,000 or less. Just again to give you a sense of the sample that we were able to gather. It's also worth noting, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this as well, but I think this is an important slide just to convey that these distinct sites were different in terms of demographic, in terms of representation. And so we have that on the screen here. And it's important to note that when I go through results to kind of contextualize some of the findings. But you can see here there was some variability across sites, and that is something, again, to strongly consider. So now going directly to sort of our primary findings here. Again, a lot of this is quite staggering, and I'll explain why here in a minute. But looking at the full sample, so close to 6,000 adults within these MVI affected communities, we were able to identify that nearly 1 in 4, so nearly 25%, 23.7% of individuals met presumptive criteria for past year PTSD. Okay, that's quite a high number, and I'll explain why. But then looking at past month PTSD, which could be used as a sort of a proxy for current PTSD, we see that almost 1 in 10 individuals in these MVI affected communities met presumptive criteria for PTSD. And then looking at depression, kind of a similar trend emerged where we see a fairly large subset of individuals meeting presumptive criteria for depression within the past year, 16.4% to be precise. And similarly, looking at past month depression or something that would be close to like current major depressive disorder, we see that rate at about 8.7% across individuals within these MVI affected communities. And so, as I mentioned a few times, that these numbers are really sobering and staggering. And in part, not only is it kind of jarring to consider that almost 1 in 4, almost 25% of the sample met presumptive criteria for PTSD within the past year, but when you look at what we know about the U.S. population writ large, you can see that rates of PTSD in our sample within the past year were 5 times higher than the national average. So 4.7% is what is sort of the prevailing idea of how many folks might be in the U.S. with PTSD within the past year. You can also see a similar thing emerging with regard to depression. So we found 16.4% of individuals in our MVI affected communities met presumptive criteria of past year depression, and that's about 8.5% nationally. So just about twice as much, again, which is really quite staggering. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to look at sort of the role of prior victimization and how that may increase risk for PTSD and depression, as well as looking at the role of social support, just to see what the association was between social support and PTSD and depression, and the association between prior victimization and PTSD and depression as well. And so to set the stage for this, just to give you a sense of just the prevalence rates of prior assault or prior victimization and high support, these are displayed here on the screen. So you can see that the majority of folks in our sample did not report, for example, prior physical or sexual assault. But you can see that, again, a pretty substantial minority of folks did. 42.7% did report prior assault at some point in their lifetime, which is quite unfortunate, but it helps to contextualize some of the findings that I'll present here in a minute. With regard to social support, we found that, again, sort of unfortunately, that most folks reported low levels of social support. So 55.7% were deemed sort of having low levels of social support, whereas 44.3% had high levels of social support. And so how now does prior victimization relate to some of these PTSD rates? And looking at just those individuals that met criteria within the past year, you can see that 38.4% of those individuals had a prior experience of a victimization, so prior physical or sexual assault, whereas 12.8% did not. And so you can start to see here that individuals that did have prior physical or sexual assault histories in terms of victimization, you can see that they seem to be at greater risk for PTSD. And you can see that is both for past year and past month. So looking at those individuals with past month PTSD, 16.6% had prior assault, whereas only 3.1% had no prior assault history within their lifetime. And so what sort of can we glean from this? As I mentioned just on that previous slide, that having a prior history of physical or sexual assault does pretty dramatically increase risk for PTSD, both for past month and within the past year. And you can see that about 4 in 10 adults with prior assault history had PTSD within the past year, which again it's a very, very high number. When you compare that with folks without prior history of assault, you can see that individuals with this history were about 5.4 times more likely to meet criteria for current PTSD, and that's worth noting. You can see that, kind of going back to that previous slide, the pattern was similar with regard to depression, but the magnitude was just a bit lower. So you can see here, similar trend emerged, prior victimization, those folks were more at risk for depression. But again, the magnitude of the association seemed to be a bit different compared to PTSD. And so looking at the role of social support, we weren't terribly surprised to to come across this finding that individuals with low social support tend to have higher levels of past year PTSD compared to those with high levels of support, as you can see there on the screen. And the same thing emerged with regard to past months. So current PTSD, you can see that 12.3% of those folks endorsed low support, whereas 5% reported high levels of support. And so moving over to sort of other ways that folks may be impacted by a mass violence incident, I think this particular set of findings may also shed light on why we found such high rates of PTSD, for example. But this is, again, comparing rates of responses to that 2019 Gallup poll question that asked, how worried are you that you or a family member will become a victim of a mass shooting or other type of mass violence attack? So very specific to sort of the reoccurrence or re-exposure to a mass violence incident. You can see that about half, if I'm doing the math correctly, or just over half of folks reported some level of worry or were very worried about a subsequent mass shooting or mass violence incident. When you look at individuals within those MVI-affected communities, you can see that rate jumps up quite a bit. So well over 60% of folks in our sample reported at least some level of worry, with just under a quarter of folks reporting that they were very worried about another mass violence incident. And I think with respect to PTSD, we wanted to get a sense of how this might generalize to other experiences, other areas in life. So not just experiencing another mass violence incident, but just experiencing criminal victimization, for example. And what we found after asking this question, how worried are you that you or a family member would become a victim of a regular violent crime, not related to mass violence? And regular is kind of an interesting word there, but we want to differentiate that from a mass violence incident. You can see once again that well over 60% of folks reported at least some level of worry, with about 1 in 5 reporting that they were very worried about that. So some major take-home points, and some of you all may have kind of gathered some of these along the way, but there's some really strong evidence from our research that shows that the ripple effect of mass violence within communities in terms of PTSD and depression especially, but other mental health complications, is really wide and vast. And I've used the word staggering a number of times here because it just frankly is. But it's also, I think, it's worth noting too that most individuals within these communities are really quite resilient. So most folks didn't go on to develop PTSD or depression. But that large number of folks that did, it reflects, again, this strong need for services and perhaps some intervention to help support these folks, because PTSD is a chronic condition. And so if one has PTSD, especially a number of years out, without intervention, without evidence-based intervention, it is unlikely that PTSD would sort of spontaneously disappear. And so that's an important thing to consider. We also know from this research, but also, again, sort of research over decades, that prior victimization, in particular physical or sexual assault victimization, is a massive risk factor for PTSD and depression and other mental health complications as well. You think of like substance use, for example. It also may be the case that being exposed to a mass violence incident within one's community could sort of reignite or exacerbate pre-existing crime-related mental health problems from, for example, a prior incident that may have occurred in one's history. Always nice including some good news. So the good news is that when folks have adequate, efficient and satisfactory levels of social support, it seems to sort of, again, insulate those individuals from the negative consequences of mental health, of mass violence incidents, rather. As I mentioned too, we talked about PTSD and depression, but I think, some of the previous question around fear or worry about a mass violence incident or just criminal victimization in general is important as well, because it's likely the case that when folks have these beliefs that, hey, I'm really worried about a mass violence incident occurring or violence occurring against me based on what's, occurred in my community, it's likely the case that their behavior, their well-being is substantially impacted. Maybe they don't, rise to the level of having PTSD, but their level of worry may impact other domains of life, and that is something to take into consideration as well. And then the final point here, before I toss it back to Elizabeth, is that it's important to know, this is why we shared the previous slide on the sort of the demographic breakdown of those 6 distinct communities, that although results were fairly similar across these communities, there were very meaningful differences as well. And a lot of our team is, a lot of the movement in our team is working on some of those subsequent analyses going forward. But I think the important takeaway there is that it's important to not consider a one-size-fits-all approach, right? To really understand the needs, the unique needs of these unique communities, and try and provide them with the best resources to help them in their recovery.
Thanks so much, Jamison. It made me think two things from my own experience. I worked in Lower Manhattan on 9/11, and as you can imagine, it was very traumatic. We had to evacuate our building. I actually saw it happen. I saw the buildings fall. I was not physically injured, but it had very long-term consequences for a lot of people in the city as a result, even those of us who were not physically impacted, although, we were in terms of being evacuated. But, one of the things that we work with communities on considering is the community impact. It's not just the direct victims. It can have wide-ranging consequences and effects on a lot of people. And, we saw that in Buffalo because the East Buffalo neighborhood that was targeted, they were targeted because of the color of their skin. And some of the folks who stepped in to assist in the aftermath were very traumatized because they knew people that had been killed or injured or impacted. And, maybe in retrospect, those were not the people that should have been responding because they needed help too. So, a lot of thought has to go into who are we considering to be victims in these cases. And, I think your goal of the prevention is awesome. And we're working with New York State on their threat assessment management teams. But what I've told them is, we can do all we can to prevent incidents from happening, but we're never going to prevent them all. And so are you ready if you don't? If your prevention efforts don't succeed in, any particular incident, are you ready to move forward with a response to assist the community? So, our whole focus is to develop kind of a wide array of resources and support for everybody, including, and everything we do is evidence-based, as you can see from Jamison's description of the research that's being done. Everything has a foundation. We work to provide programming, many different kinds of services. We offer strategies for communities. We want to make sure that you're thinking through who needs to be at the table from beginning to end, from deciding how we're going to plan for this, all the way through to however long it's going to take. And as Jamison said, no community is the same, no victim is the same. Their recovery is going to be their recovery, and it's going to depend on a whole wide variety of factors. In Buffalo, it was a very high violence area, and so they were already traumatized. They already had high levels of PTSD. They were a community that had been severely under-resourced and marginalized by the greater city. In fact, Buffalo was, I think, maybe at one time the sixth most segregated city in the country, which is saying a lot. And so there were consequences there were factors that were already existing at the time that this happened that created a lot of other problems in the recovery. So, as I said earlier, our focus is on behavioral and mental health. We want to make sure that this is something that is included in all plans, and that you understand what your resources are and understand where your needs and gaps are. What don't you have, and where are you going to get it? Who is trained? I remember seeing a video by a survivor from Lewiston, Maine, who said, yeah, they had therapists, and she had one, and it wasn't helpful because the person wasn't trauma trained. Somebody who does one kind of therapy may not be the appropriate person to work with someone who has been through something like this. So, thinking through those kinds of things and what other supports are available for people with disabilities. Like in Lewiston, again, they had a large hard of hearing and deaf community that was directly impacted by this. And there were a lot of consequences because they had to kind of scramble to get together a system that could assist these victims in the same way they were able to assist the hearing victims. And, fundamentally, it's about building partnerships with everybody and really thinking through, like, who's not at the table, like who would be involved. There's the obvious choices of law enforcement and emergency managers and, hospitals and Red Cross, but who else really should be at the table and provide the most support for these victims. Next slide. So what we do is, our division of preparedness is called Improving Community Preparedness and Training and Technical Assistance. So ICP TTA, because the government, we love our acronyms. But what this is really is working with communities in whatever means and whatever ways are appropriate for them. So we can come in and do trainings, we can do webinars, we can work one-on-one, we can help figure out like who should be at the table. You guys kind of already have that done, but to focus on, what are your victim and survivor resources and your mental and behavioral health resources, and how do we work together to make sure that victims are covered on both ends of the spectrum. And so we can help you write your plan or write in a victim component to the plan. We can do tabletops and facilitated scenario discussions, kind of anything people need and are looking for, just reach out to us. And, mass violence cases are different from mass disasters in a lot of different ways. I mean, certainly communities suffer from PTSD and other disorders as a result of mass disasters, but there's an additional trauma that comes from being targeted in this way. And you can have really long-term consequences. And, one thing that we often use a slide in our trainings is to show kind of, healing isn't linear. And you can, you have that sort of pink cloud when things first happen where everybody comes together and the community is involved with the recovery, and then things begin to fray and things like financial donations come in, and that creates a lot of problems because people feel there's like a hierarchy of suffering. And then you have how are we going to commemorate this? And then there's a lot of fighting and difficulty in navigating what people want because everybody feels impacted differently. And so this can go on for quite a long time, and it's something that communities really need to think about. Next. So here's some of the lessons that we've all learned in responding to these events. You're never prepared as much as you prepare. And I don't mean that to say like, oh, don't bother preparing then because it's all a crapshoot. But I was a trial lawyer for many years, and every day was like a whole different trial. One day you'd be on top of the world, and the next day you just wanted to run out of the courtroom crying. And it can feel like that sometimes when you're responding to something like this, because you've got everything lined up, and then you're going to have a lot of different things happen. But if you are prepared, you will have the right people on speed dial that you can go to. You will know who to go to sort of get that particular thing remedied or to get that resource. And it will, in the long run, it will make things much, much easier for you. Collaborating constantly is a must. You have to have the team set up, then you got to practice it. And then you have to stay together and make sure that you know who your people are. People leave jobs all the time. And so, don't not look at that list and that person is gone and now you don't know who took their place. That will not be helpful. Everybody has to be flexible, of course, and understanding that even in, if you're in a county, your whole county is not a monolith, right? You've got urban areas and suburban areas and maybe some rural areas. The challenges are going to be different in every single one of these. And every type of mass violence incident is different as well. And it's going to hit people differently, depending on what the circumstances are. So you really have to be very adaptable in these kinds of cases to, and understanding what the different kinds of micro communities within your larger group will need, and talking about Lewiston, right? That the deaf and hard of hearing community needed something completely different from, or in addition to what other victims needed. So really understanding your community and thinking through, how are we ready to address everyone's well-being? Identifying leaders in some of the ones, if you respond in New York City, it's real clear. The leaders are there and they'll tell you that they're the leaders. It doesn't work that way in every community. And sometimes that's a real challenge, is finding the people who, in one we responded to, the person that we were given from the mayor's office left his job, that was leaving his job 5 days later. So the person that we were relying on to get us things and to help us navigate everything was leaving in 5 days and there wasn't a warm handoff. It was very confusing. The other thing is, you'll identify, and you probably have through committee work that you do, is, who says they do the work and who does the work. Identify those people. Identify those people who say they do the work, because they're going to be your best friends and they're going to follow through. Probably one of the most challenging things I've experienced as a result of working in the government for a long time was managing expectations of those above you and the politics. The hardest thing with a mass violence incident is it gets tons and tons and tons of attention and press. And so, another problem is that as soon as something else happens, the attention all goes away. And that has its own set of consequences, because people don't want the attention. And then when it's pulled out from under them, they feel like nobody cares. And that just adds a level of trauma that you don't need to be dealing with. Next. So one of the things that we train on, and I think we're running close to time, but we will work with your communities to look at, these are 16 best practices that were developed by subject matter experts over time who have responded to mass violence events. And these are pretty indicative of almost every mass violence event. You're going to see all this stuff. And so it's good to be mindful of all these different aspects of a mass violence preparedness plan, so that you're ready to deal with, if your offender was caught and is going to be tried, you have that, who sets up the family assistance center, how are you going to deal with trauma of first responders, memorials, financials, volunteers come out of the woodwork. Everyone wants to bring their dog, whether they bite people or not. So you want to make sure that you have thought through all of this about credentialing people and making sure that victims feel safe. Next. So basically, we want to assist communities in doing what's right for them, and making sure that they are heard and that they are supported. Okay, we're just finishing up here. So these slides are going to be made available. We have all of these resources on, we have 2 websites. We have the mass violence website, and we also have the ICPTTA website, which have some of the same material, but a lot of different material. And there's all kinds of resource guides and things for you that, we can distribute to you or that you can go in and get. These are just some of the things that we have. Jamison, can we make these slides available for them? Send them a...
Yeah, I'm sure there's no issue with that. We
Great.
can confer with the team, but yeah, I would think that'd be a great idea. Yep.
And Sarah says she needs to edit the slides before we send them out. So we will have Sarah send them out to you, Jamie. But, basically what we want is this to be a one-stop shop for people who are either looking to plan for mass violence or who have been through it and want more resources. We have so much on the website and available to you that involve the research that the psychologists have done and all sorts of psychological, behavioral, mental health resources. So thanks very much for having us.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Jamison. That was a really insightful presentation. Definitely gave, I think, this group a lot of food for thought and helped us understand this really complex
Oh,
thing.
and Jamie, let me just cut in for a second.
Yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
all free. So I know everyone loves to hear that any of the work that we do for you is free to you. So if we come out to see you, if we come out to work with you, if we work with you online, whatever it is, it's all free of charge.
Everyone loves hearing that, especially I think here in Washington State right now with our budget.
We're actually working with a county in Washington State.
Well, now we have about 15 minutes for questions from task force members. I invite you to either, like I said, raise your hand or use I think if the reactions are working today on Zoom's functions, you can use that one as well. Or if you want to put it in the chat, I will go back and forth between just to make sure we get everyone. And Nate, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And Elizabeth, thanks for the presentation. And Jamison. One of the things that occurred to me is we're thinking about the consequence management and its relationship to mental health is that often has a not insignificant cost associated with it. And there's also a big challenge. I think, Elizabeth, you mentioned finding professionals that actually have the right type of training to be in that space. This just sort of leads me into this thought, and I don't know if you have an answer for it, but maybe it's something that we can explore at some point. But is there any sort of cost analysis that looks at the relationship between the expenses of doing a response like that and the costs of being able to prevent these types of events, and sort of looking at that return on investment from a mental and behavioral health context? Thank you.
Well, I can answer a couple of those things, and then Jamison, you may have more with the on the psychological side. But one thing that's good with response is that the federal government community can apply for something called an AEAP grant. That's for up to 3 years. And through that grant, you can hire all kinds of people, and get training for them on, trauma response. And so that could be very helpful. There's also, there was SAMHSA grants, but I don't know. It said they're cutting 50% of the programs. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but there are SAMHSA grants that are specifically designed for these kinds of events. There's also, like, the National Organization of Victim Advocacy, also known as NOVA, will do crisis response training for communities. There's also psychological first aid training available for those who are going sort of at the beginning of a response. Those kinds of trainings are also available. And, what we found when we were in Buffalo is because this was a hate crime, a lot of the victim assistance programs that were funded through my former agency did not have enough therapists of color. And there was a lot of pushback from the community, understandably, like, we want people who look like us and also offer culturally appropriate or culturally sensitive services that were really hard to find. And so that's part of the planning process too, is, you know, what's even available out there. So I know that doesn't answer the question about prevention. I think that, you know, that's something that I think the community has to decide where they're going to invest their money, of course, and get people trained. I mean, they can train regular therapists in trauma training, I assume, Jamison, right?
Yeah, it's a really, I think, very fascinating question, Nathan, because it is an important one, right? Like, how, if we have to think about efficiency and budgeting, right? Like what is going to be the biggest bang for our buck, perhaps? And you know, I just some comments because I don't have the answer, unfortunately. I mean, I think for me as a scientist, like that's a very straightforward empirical question that you know needs to be answered. I think it would greatly inform response and prevention going forward. But Elizabeth's right. I think you know what I saw firsthand just a few weeks back in Lewiston was the impact of not having enough trained professionals. I mean, that was like the end all be all. That was the biggest thing that was impacting folks currently. You had, you know, over a year out now since the event, and folks, there's still a number of folks who are really struggling. And as we were kind of scanning through, me and a colleague, of, you know, who is trauma informed, who's trauma trained in evidence-based practice, the amount of folks was abominably slow. It was very small. And so, you know, I think we want to provide the best care to folks, and the best care is that we know has a good chance of working, and we know it has a good chance of working based on the research. And so I know that in NMVC, the Mass Violence Center, you know, like Elizabeth was saying, we offer trainings in things like psychological first aid or skills for psychological recovery, which is for the kind of the immediate aftermath of a mass violence incident. And the important thing there is that you don't have to be a clinical psychologist to provide that type of support. It's not a clinical intervention. It's really sort of more like resiliency enhancing skills that can be provided to anybody immediately after an event. But in terms of longer term care, some of the best practices for things like PTSD require a high level of training. And there is options for that. And the National Mass Violence Center does indeed offer some of those trainings for community providers. And we're very active in that. And there's also different ways of getting trained. I was just in Lewiston just a few weeks ago, like I mentioned, doing an in-person training. Then last week we had a virtual training, and we're also developing sort of web-based training as well. So you could do it kind of on the fly on your own time. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think me and Elizabeth have a specific answer. It's a very important question. And to me, the main takeaway is that like we really do, despite costs and difficulty, we need more folks trained in evidence-based practice, particularly for things like PTSD and depression, as we know that's highly relevant following mass violence. Thank you for the question.
And I think, you know, getting your state office of mental health, your community offices of mental health, to look at this issue specifically, maybe to kind of garner their resources to address this.
And then, Miri, before we go to you, I saw, Mercedes, you put a question in the chat. I'm just wondering if there's been any mass violence events in Washington, and if yes, an analysis on the response. I don't necessarily expect Elizabeth or Jamison to know or answer that, but yes, unfortunately, there have been instances of mass violence, specifically mass shootings across Washington state. There was a mass shooting at the Jewish Federation here in Seattle back in the early 2000s, and we've also had a mass shooting at a school here. I also do not know if there's been analysis done, but that's something as staff that I can look into, and we can continue to talk about that in future meetings. So thank you for bringing that up, Mercedes. Miri, we'll go to you, and then we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions after Miri. And if there's still any remaining questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll collect them for the record, or you can also email me after the fact, and I can follow up with Elizabeth Jamison, and we can continue to kind of, again, bring this information into subsequent meetings. So I don't want to make everyone feel like they can't get their answers today. But Miri, your turn.
Thank you, James and Elizabeth. Thank you for a really great presentation. So my background is actually right in that. My dissertation was about the trauma of terrorism, and I'm a trauma psychologist. So everything you said, especially the part about finding the right resources, I could not agree with you more. Part of my training was with organization in Israel that doing a lot of work with community-based intervention and train-the-trainer model. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any organization here that can take similar approaches where, because we know, like you said, the effect goes beyond those who were directly exposed. We know that there is indirect exposure, even from a biological perspective, from the research about 9/11. So how can we then spread it to make sure that we're really reaching the whole communities across and also specifically, how do we identify people in need that might not be the one, because they're indirect exposure, how do we identify those people who might not be the first one in line to say, hey, I have trauma, I need support?
You know, it's interesting when we were the first week after Buffalo, we were at the Family Assistance Center and a man came in because he wanted to pay his water bill or something. And they had done all of that at the top supermarket. And so they had to set up a place where people could come in and pay their bills. So somebody sent him over to me and he's like, oh, you know, I want to pay my bill. And I chatted with him for a couple minutes and then he burst into tears and said he had been in the store and the person he was with had gotten shot in front of him. And he just came in to pay his bill. So I think you're spot on in terms of how the community has to think about everybody's needs and, you know, what's available for them. So you need to know what you have and what you don't have. And then you have to know how they're trained and how they're not trained. And a train-the-trainer model is an excellent way, I think, to get people trained where they maybe wouldn't have the ability to go get the training someplace else. And, you know, when you do psychological first aid and NOVA and other organizations do those kinds of trainings, if you get those people at the beginning, you're already ahead of the game. You know, if you get people's Maslow's hierarchy needs met, right, you know, getting those basic needs met, and then making sure that whoever is operating this world, the Resiliency Center and the Family Assistance Center, that they're reaching farther out than just the people who are immediately impacted. You know, we funded a program on a tribal nation in New York on domestic violence, and they weren't hiring. And they said, well, we can't find somebody who's both Indian and a domestic violence provider. And we're like, okay, but we can help you get them trained. You know, like maybe you can't find both at once, but you're going to make that person. And so some of it may be, you know, like that, where we have to create kind of a new system for identifying therapists and counselors who are willing to step into that role and get trained. I don't know, Jamison, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's another really important question, Miri, and I'm so glad to see that you are trauma trained. You're a psychologist. It's good, because I'm always shocked to see that is not the case for many providers in these communities. And you know, I guess I've been sort of insulated in this space where that's all I do is evidence-based treatment. And so, you know, how do we improve that sort of that potential in communities is a really important question. One I could spend probably hours on. I mean, we have avenues at the National Mass Violence Center through training and technical assistance. I imagine could assist with that, for example. And so that's one avenue. You know, how to prop up evidence-based practice so that more providers are even aware of it, and that it's sort of the focus and the priority is incredibly important. I don't know how to do that. I think that's more of a sort of a training level writ large, of course, but also societally as well. And so I don't have a great specific answer for you there, Mary. Maybe you have ideas.
Well, actually, you just pointed something. I think maybe the area, as you mentioned, programs, right? So I'm all about evidence-based therapy. Literally, that's my training, and I think what I've been noticing in the psychology field, we're shifting away from it, unfortunately, and we're not using the same data. And when I think so, you know, I came here for grad school, And because of this practitioner model, scientific model, that's something that was really appealing to me. Maybe starting in universities and in school to make sure that the people who are going to be then on the front line getting the right evidence-based intervention and in the grad level, but also when we think about schools, just like K to 12, I think teachers should be more informed. I mean, a lot of schools would say we're trauma informed, but they're not. But identifying triggers, right? I'm thinking about what's going on right now around us. And so many students, I work a lot with the K to 12, are triggered by what's happening. And people might not be aware that this is because some of them were exposed to terrorist attack in the past or were exposed to mass violence in general. And I think if teachers, because that's kind of like the point person that can see them, maybe we can catch them somehow.
The other thing is there is a whole often untapped resource where every state gets federal dollars to fund victim assistance programs. They're in every state, every territory. Many of the therapists in those locations are trauma trained because they're working with trauma victims, sexual assault, domestic violence, gun violence, whatever it is. So they're already there. And so it's when you're thinking this through, it's identifying those programs that are in your specific community to say, can you step in or can you train? Because they do a lot of training. Your domestic violence coalitions, your sexual assault coalitions, they all do training. And they can provide some of that trauma training, at least in the short term, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Mary, I just real quick too, I want to also highlight something that you said that was really important as well, because it relates to the question you had about how do we identify folks that are perhaps most vulnerable, or as a way to be perhaps most efficient, right? If we have to kind of pick and choose. And I think it goes back to the science, like you're saying, like better understanding the impact of prior trauma, how that relates to response to something like a mass violence incident that occurs in our community that I wasn't there, I didn't know anybody, but still like, oh my goodness, it's bringing up these reactions that could lead to something that is impairing or dysfunctional, right? And so the science shows, just like I presented earlier, that those individuals with a number of risk factors, but primarily those with prior victimization, sexual or physical assault, are incredibly at risk for PTSD. And so to me, I would say, if we had to start somewhere, let's start with getting resources to those folks in a way that is very inviting and warm, because those are the most important folks, I think, to identify. And then also kind of a more broad stroke, just beefing up social support is really important. Emotional processing, for example, of PTSD is kind of at the bedrock of how we recover from PTSD. And if you don't have people to talk about how you're feeling and what had happened, then it sort of really blocks that natural recovery. And so I think from a sort of a society standpoint, just beefing up our ability to engage with our compassionate networks would be another avenue to take.
Well, I'm going to have to stop this very fruitful conversation. I can only imagine that we probably could have devoted the whole meeting to your presentation. And
we could talk all day. So.
Absolutely. This is a really important issue and it deserves, more conversation for us to understand. I just wanted to make a note of the kind of remaining comments in the chat, but we're just going to mark those for the record, and I will follow up with the National Mass Violence Center as well as task force members if they have additional questions in regards to today's presentation. But Katrina had, mentioned, how do we get folks trauma trained who are not community leaders and not traditional therapists? We can't assume that everyone is ready or willing to trust those providers, which I think Elizabeth spoke to slightly in the response that happened in Buffalo. There were not Black trauma-informed counselors to be able to work with that population.
The other thing, Jamie, is that we have to think really creatively about who does the work in communities. So my former agency funded social workers and case managements in the street outreach program, the violence interrupters, because those were the people that had the trust of the community. They weren't coming to the police. They weren't coming to regular victim assistance services, but they did trust them. And so, really when you're planning, think through how, people that maybe at first you go, what? That's not a partner I would think of, because they can really get you access to the community in a very different way. Sorry to interrupt, Jamie.
No, that's a great point, Elizabeth. That makes me think of coaches and other mentors and people who have really meaningful connections in people's lives could be thought of as a part of this system as well. Kate had mentioned it would be great to learn more about what resources are available in Washington and how, as a task force, we can make recommendations to better leverage those. So that's something I will note as staff and continue to look into. And then Sarah had put in the chat that would be probably helpful for panelists and task force members to know that UW and WSU, which are the two large universities here in the state, so their schools of medicine, psychology, and global health have a number of experts studying community-based trauma interventions following violence and conflict, as well as the use of evidence-supported mental health practices in non-traditional spaces. And then Miri added at the end, I would add that community's response with empathy can prevent trauma and validation, which can lead to higher rates of PTSD. And also thinking about intergenerational trauma, how we can help parents recognize the ways that trauma may affect their parenting skills. Well, I think this has been a really great conversation. We did go a little bit over time, but I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Jamison, for joining us today.
We're happy to come back.
I'm sure you might regret saying that, but we really appreciate you taking the time to join with us. We are going to take a 5-minute break because I want to make sure everyone can get a moment to stretch their legs, refill coffee or water. So I'm going to give you a 4-minute break because I like coming back at 10:25 on the dot. So I will see you
everybody
at 10:25, and thank you again, Elizabeth and Jamison.
Thank you. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Welcome back, everyone. Just going to give a moment. Just either give a thumbs raise if you're back or flash your camera back on. Wonderful. So I'm going to be giving a short presentation here, talking a little bit about what we know about sort of the pathway towards violence, the risk and protective factors that are related towards being a victim or a perpetrator of violence, and then connecting it to this group's task to make recommendations within a public health framework. My presentation is going to be fairly high level. That's why I'm going to turn the floor over to Roger then afterwards, where he's going to talk about the work Projects for Civil Society does in our community to prevent violence. So thank you, Roger, for agreeing to present with me today. Let me make sure my presentation works and get my slides up. Is everyone able to see my slides? Okay. And can you spotlight me? So as we discussed in January, the philosophy within public health is that all violence is predictable and therefore all violence is preventable. Many individuals who have engaged in targeted violence have moved along an identifiable pathway. And I'm going to be using targeted violence for these first few slides as it refers to violence that is against a specific population based on ideology, grievances, or hate. Targeted violence is a broad term which includes mass shootings, school shootings, and violence that is directed at public figures or individuals that are targeted due to their identities, which is, I think, an important thing to note, as this group is also tasked with thinking about extremism. This pathway to violence framework was created to better understand and identify concerning actions and behaviors that can potentially lead to targeted violence, and it provides us with opportunities to be thinking about early prevention, intervention, and de-escalation points. This pathway can oftentimes begin with a real or perceived grievance based on ideological, personal, or other factors. In this phase, the person is thinking of themselves as a victim and is trying to find a like-minded group to affirm them, and oftentimes that's happening in online spaces. The ideation phase is where someone begins to determine that violence is an acceptable or even necessary means then to address that grievance. From there, people often begin the process of researching and planning, which can include picking potential suspects, to then moving on to preparation, which can include acquiring new skills or resources. The breach phase typically includes surveillance or dry runs in advance of a formal attack. It's really important to note, though, that not every individual who engages in these behaviors or actions will pose a threat or commit an act of violence. Furthermore, not every individual will follow this linear process. So therefore, there are several states that have been creating plans to prevent targeted violence. I pulled this graphic from New York's prevention plan, and those plans note that the early intervention and identification of risk factors and indicators is really critical for this issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know as it relates to risk and protective factors that are related to violence. And I'm going to note at the beginning here that the risk factors I speak of can be held widely across our population, and they're therefore not predictive of violence at an individual level. So therefore, for this group, it's really important to be thinking about how we can be enhancing these protective factors and mitigate risk factors at a population and community level. And I'm going to go just through two of the risk factors on the screen now. In a study done looking at mass shootings between 1966 and 2019, suicidality was found to be a strong predictor. 30% of those mass shooters were suicidal prior to the shooting, and 39% were suicidal during. This was found to be much higher for younger shooters, with K through 12 students found to be suicidal in 92% of cases. And when the shooters were college or university students, they were found to be suicidal in 100% of the cases. In another study that was done in 2014 and 2019, again looking at mass shootings here in the United States, they found that 59% of the mass shootings were domestic violence related. And 68% of the shootings, the perpetrator had either killed at least one family member, their partner, or had had a history of domestic violence. And so while we do know that there are risk factors that are related to violence, we also know that there are protective factors, and I'll just name a few now. They can be having strong ties to one's community, positive relationships with friends, families, peers, and intimate partners. And if an individual is experiencing a grievance, that they have a diversity of outlets to be able to address that. So connecting it to a public health model. Well, a public health approach envisions thriving communities and individuals who are more resilient to violence. This approach focuses on general health, safety, and well-being, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention use a 4-level social ecological model to better understand violence and the effects of potential prevention strategies. And this model analyzes the interplay between individual, relationship, community, and societal factors, which I will go through here in a second. And the model suggests that to prevent violence, it requires action simultaneously across all of these levels. So the societal level looks at broad factors that can foster a climate in which violence is encouraged or discouraged. These factors include social and cultural norms that support violence as an acceptable means to resolve conflicts. Large societal factors can include health, economic, educational, and social policies that help maintain economic or social inequalities between groups in our society. And prevention efforts then in this sort of area can include promoting social norms that protect against violence, as well as others that impact the structural determinants of health. The community level examines community settings where social relationships occur and can hopefully flourish. We're talking about our schools, our workplaces, neighborhoods, community centers, and we're seeking to identify the characteristics of each setting that could increase the likelihood of someone becoming a victim or a perpetrator of violence. Prevention then focuses on creating safe spaces where people can live, work, and play by addressing the conditions that give rise to violence. The relationship level examines the close relationships that can increase the risk of experiencing violence again as either the victim or the perpetrator. At this level, relationships can include an individual's closest peers, their partners, their family members, and prevention strategies can include programming to promote positive peer norms, problem-solving skills, and healthy relationships. And finally, the individual level then seeks to identify both biological and personal history factors that could increase the likelihood of an individual again becoming a victim or a perpetrator of violence. And prevention approaches can include conflict resolution, social emotional learning, and safe dating or healthy relationship programs again. So this group is tasked with creating recommendations on a comprehensive public health approach to address mass violence. And so we can break that into 4 approaches that reduce individual and community risk of mobilization to violence. So this is primordial prevention, primary prevention, secondary, and tertiary. Primordial prevention's goals are to foster more healthy and resilient communities by tackling the social factors that negatively impact individuals and communities. So thinking about those societal level factors I was talking about. At a community level, examples of those negative factors can include racism, hate crimes, and polarization. And at an individual level, we can be talking about the loneliness epidemic, as well as experiencing domestic abuse. And efforts and prevention efforts in this area can include programs then that try and boost civic engagement in our communities, as well as increase youth resiliency. And those are just 2 of many strategies. Primary prevention's goals are to prevent violence through then more concerted efforts to build community and individual resilience. So these efforts can include broad training and awareness on those risk and protective factors that I've mentioned. And when I mean broad training, I mean our community leaders, our coaches, our teachers, maybe some of these trusted people in our community that we were just speaking about in our last discussion. And other strategies can also be efforts that try and counter polarization narratives, which can be known as media literacy or digital citizenship. Secondary prevention's goals are to develop the infrastructure and capacity then to provide interventions for vulnerable people as needed. So now we're thinking maybe as individuals are moving along that pathway towards targeted violence and starting to think about how we can have off-ramps towards interventions and getting people into the services that they need. Tertiary is the final level of prevention, and it is very similar to secondary. However, now we are focusing on those whom have already mobilized to violence and are otherwise involved in our criminal justice system. But I want to root that this is, tied in non-punitive, non-carceral methods. And so we're talking about, again, referral services and interventions, as well as our re-entry into our communities. And I also want to note that corollary to tertiary prevention is making sure that our community is cared for when a mass violence incident occurs. As we just heard from the National Mass Violence Center, there are both long-term and rippling impacts when these events actually happen in our communities. And so it is important that this group is also thinking about local government and community leadership's responses to be able to ensure that the proper services are implemented, speaking of victim services, as well as mental health care when these events occur. And so now I just want to close with some state-level programs that sort of fit within this public health framework. As we spoke to in the last meeting, also, there's already a lot of work that's being done in our communities that is tied to the issues we're talking to, and they could be tailored to think more about extremism specifically. But the ones that are seeking to reduce violence in our communities now, and I'll just name one at the Washington State Department of Health, is its Injury and Violence Prevention Program, which has many focuses, but 2 that relate to the risk factors I speak to today are the Suicide Prevention Program, so our state's 988 line, as well as the Sexual and Domestic Violence Prevention resources they have. Internally at the Attorney General's office here in Washington State, we have Hear Me Wa, which is a safe space for youth to report safety and well-being concerns and get connected to resources. And then finally, the Hate Crimes and Bias Incident Hotline is going to be piloting this summer in 3 counties, King, Clark, and Spokane, to help residents who experience a hate crime or bias incident get connected with resources again. And this program is then going to go statewide in January of 2027. So I will stop now, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Roger here. And I'm just going to ask for task force members to hold their questions till the end of Roger's presentation, and then we can just have a discussion on both.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I've been off the grid for almost 2 weeks, and I'm in the throes of reentry, and hence don't have a PowerPoint and slides. So I'm just gonna ramble on. Bear with me. My perspective on this is I come primarily from working with perpetrators, and I'll get to that later, but one of the things about working with perpetrators is we find out that we end up working with trauma again anyway, because as most of you know, hurt people hurt people. And we find that most of our perpetrators carry pretty heavy burdens of PTSD. I work for a little nonprofit in Seattle called Projects for a Civil Society, but it is the Puget Sound home of a larger network called the Alternatives to Violence Project. AVP has 8,000 facilitators around the world. We've worked with over 1 million people in 80 countries. So we've got a very long history and profound institutional memory or learning on these things. AVP started in a prison in New York with inmates after the Attica prison riot. A number of them had been moved out. If some of you may not remember the Attica prison riot, but they killed, I believe it was the state National Guard or patrol killed about 45 inmates. Turned out that after the riot that the inmates hadn't killed any of the fatalities. Anyway, several of them were moved to Greenhaven, and a number of inmates there wanted to work on a program to prevent young people from coming to prison. And the prison, of course, they put together something called the think tank, and it's a very powerful thing to actually see that they did a lot of social activism work as inmates. But they put together this think tank. The institution said they needed outside sponsors. They went to Quakers who were running a visiting program in the prison, and the Quakers came in to help. They have a long history of nonviolence and conflict resolution and such. And the Quakers brought in a fellow named Bernard Lafayette, who was with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and on staff to Martin Luther King. He was also John Lewis's college roommate, and went through all the SNCC training and things with them. He came to help. They got this program going. It went from prison to prison, was found very, very effective and powerful for those who participated in it. I like to say it eventually escaped from prison. It was going from prison to prison as inmates transferred or wrote people in other prisons. It escaped from prison and started going into schools, started going international. And as I say, it's done work in over 80 countries. I have colleagues who have helped children child soldiers out of the FARC guerrillas. I have a friend who has worked with Boko Haram in Kenya, or Nigeria rather, and he has worked both with the girls who were kidnapped and with the extremists. We have programs bringing perpetrators and victims together after the Rwanda genocide in Rwanda. We've worked with many communities there, helping them to live in community again with each other after the reconciliation trials. Just as a side note, all of the reconciliation judges in that effort were trained in AVP before they started doing hearings around the country. So my own experience, I started in 2004 working with inmates in Monroe, both at the Washington State Reformatory, which is now closed, and the Twin Rivers Unit. I've worked with about 4,000 inmates. And when I say worked with them, I'm talking 20 to 40 hours with them, but we do group work. I've worked with 700 veterans between the Pierce County Jail and the King County Jail, all with PTSD. Just as a side note there, we were expecting to find a lot of combat-related PTSD, but a shocking amount of the PTSD these folks carried was from their childhood. I've done work with the Washington, I'm blocking, the State Department through the WAC with groups from over 30 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Colombia. So what our program looks like is that it is experiential. We bring 15 to 20 people together at a time. And we have a very choreographed set of exercises. We have a phenomenal number of exercises, something like 800 of them. We've got manuals in over 15 languages, and a highly adaptable, versatile program that we can change at a moment's notice by how we arrange the exercises and such. We bring groups of 15 to 20 together and have them engage in a very slow process of building connection, building community, and eventually empathy and compassion for each other. To give you an idea of when I started doing this, I was working in maximum security prison, and I would have in the room, I would have Aryan nations, Aryan families, Bloods, Crips, Norteños, Sureños, Mexican mafia, all in the room together. These are folks who want to hurt each other outside of that room. And we would run through this process. And at the end of 20 hours, we do 8 hours a day, 3 days in a row. Typically, that's our best practices model. And in the course of doing that, we start with well, let me back up. I mentioned the hurt people. And we find in the thousands of people I've worked with, almost every violent offender I've worked with has suffered significant violence themselves and significant trauma, or had very high ACE scores, adverse childhood experience scores. We figured out early on that we got more violence reduction by working on the psychic pain and trauma and healing that. And trauma, as a lot of you will know, causes alienation, isolation, shame, anger. And we work very carefully and methodically to build up self-esteem, build connection through conversations, structured conversations with each other, and then a sense of community. And that can take a day and a half to get people to a point of trust where we can start going deeper and deeper. Along the way, we do start teaching social emotional skills. We teach people how to identify their emotions and what are the needs beneath those emotions, and then we work on communication skills, how to get those needs met, and how to communicate those needs in ways that people want to help you meet them. a lot of folks who have unmet needs express them in ways that actually assure they're never going to get met, and often anger and violence. So we work through this process. We have, like I say, groups of 15 to 20. We find that below 50, much below 12, we might have trouble getting the critical mass to get people to step up and be vulnerable and share. Much above 20, we find that the intimacy of the group starts to get lost, and there will be people in the group who you haven't talked to and haven't spoken to, and thus won't feel comfortable being vulnerable with. We go through a very structured process to get people more and more comfortable with vulnerability and sharing deeper and deeper. Just as a little aside, my first time in prison to work on this, I went in as a volunteer, but I was a participant, just to participate at the level of the others. And first time in prison, it was it was quite unsettling. I'm a big guy, I'm 6 foot, 200 pounds, but I felt small walking in those rooms. And about a day and a half into the workshop, this one blood gang member, very large guy, he keeps sitting next to me. Well, I won't tell you about his tattoo. It was very unnerving. Had a cursive tattoo on his neck that every time I looked at him, I'd end up reading. But a day and a half in, he stopped the whole workshop. He goes, hold on. I just got to say something. And he looks at me and he says, I'm a gangster, and you're supposed to be afraid of me. And he says, but we're talking like we're next door neighbors, and I don't know what's going on, but I really like it. And that's when I got hooked. But this is happening, that kind of connection and feeling is happening between Bloods and Aryan families, Norteños and Sureños. It's hard to believe, but I've done close to 500 of these workshops, and I was interested in what Mary was saying about the train the trainers model, because we do this with lay people. We have psychologists, we have social workers, we've got academics on the teams who bring their knowledge, and they've helped design the curriculum. But we do it with the lay people, and like when I work in prison, I will have 2 people from outside and 2 inmates. And invariably, the inmates have committed several murders, and they are our facilitators to help teach nonviolence. We have a basic workshop, and we do advanced workshops. And then we have training for facilitators. And with 100 hours of training, believe it or not, we can get people on the team. Now, they have to work under a more experienced mentor and such, and the amount of the load they'll carry initially is, less heavy, shall we say. But part of what's happening in this model, and I was thinking about this in terms of some of what was presented in the trauma front, is we actually do trauma workshops. I mentioned we have the Rwanda program. We have a separate trauma school that came out of work after the Indonesia Civil War. And those have been blended in Colombia and Guatemala into kind of a third school. But anyway, the community is talking. We bring 20 people together. The fact that I'm an old white guy and not familiar with prison culture when I started showing up doesn't matter, because I have them talking to each other. I mean, I will get in the circle and be an equal, but they're talking to each other. And the effect of that is it's always culturally appropriate and culturally relevant, because the community is talking to the community. And thus I can do the same exercises in 8th grade school, in an 8th grade school setting, as I do with veterans in a jail setting, or maximum security inmates in prison. I may change an exercise here or there, but they are talking to each other and learning from each other. That's one of the main parts of this, is that they learn from each other. The center of what we do is something called transforming power. And one of the miracles to me of this program is we'll have 20 people in the room, and by the end of the 3 days, each one of them will have figured out something that they want to transform in their life, what they need to change. And they leave feeling equipped to do it. They're radically different things that they need to work on, but the nature of the conversation and the work helps them identify it and ask others about it and get focused. And then we provide tools that help them feel that they can accomplish that. So let's see. As I mentioned, we do work in schools looking at the public health model. I would note that, we do what I consider almost like a vaccination program, going into the schools and working with the general population in schools. Several schools have given us the first 4 days of school before they take a single academic class. And we'll go in and build connection, build community, and no kid feels left out. There's no alienation. There's no cliques. Bullying practically disappears. I should have forwarded an article from Atlantic Monthly on a school in Philadelphia that in 1 year went from 138 police calls to 15. And to do that, we first trained teachers. We trained the teachers in how to do this, and then we started training students. The secondary population is the at-risk population. And so recruitment to these causes, to violent extremism and et cetera, can happen in school. It tends to happen in jails, prisons, refugee camps, sometimes faith communities, more radical faith communities. But we can get into these places. We have work in refugee camps around the world. I have a friend who's a facilitator with us here who is doing work with South Sudan refugees in Kenya. So anyway, we find by healing the trauma and such, we get these massive reductions in violence, and by helping people transform, being vulnerable. The big thing is empathy too. We put people together to talk, and we'll, just as an example, we have something we call concentric circles. We break the group up into 2 groups. One group sits in a circle facing out, the other group pairs up with them facing in, and we give them 3 minutes to talk about somebody you admire and why. And, I'll see something like people from opposing gangs. They both chose their mother, and they're talking about what they admire about their mom, and it just fills them with warmth and empathy for the other. At the end of those 3 minutes, they get up, they move, they sit with a new stranger, and they do that again. And we go all the way around the circle with deeper and deeper and deeper questions. And it creates a tremendous amount of empathy and connection. There's a real strong sense of community that comes out. We've got some evidence-based research. In Delaware, in the prison program, we found, I think it was a 48, almost 50%. It was like 48.7% reduction in recidivism, measured 3 years after release. So we are, in this short program, actually laying new neural pathways that are impacting people, 3 years out. My work with the veterans, there's a test called the STAXI, State Trait Anger Index, which does all sorts of anger measurements, but the trait anger is kind of your thermostat setting, how angry you are normally. Our vets were off the charts. They were 22% higher than the man on the street norm for their age groups. And for comparison, prison tends to be 6% angrier than the norm. Psychiatric units tend to be 9% above norm. Our vets were 22% above the norm. We do pre and post testing and found that they had dropped to 15% below the norm. And then follow-up research 2 years later showed they were still hanging below normal anger levels. So with that, it's a little bit of not a big stretch or extrapolation to say that when we can drop anger levels that much, we're also dropping violence. And just an aside, we try to teach a lot of facilities teach anger management and try to teach anger management skills. I had a guy who was doing time for attempted murder come up to me and say, I've been in the system for 20 years. He says, I've taken anger management more times than I can count. And he says, they're trying to teach me not to be angry. And he says, you guys teach me what to do when I get angry. I can do that. I can't not get angry. And we try to impress upon them that, Gandhi was an angry man. Martin Luther King was an angry man. They had good reason to be angry, but they had skills and they had tools. Anyway, I'm rambling on. We get substantial reductions. We work primarily on perpetrators, but we also have these preventative programs in the schools. Yeah, I guess with that, I'll sit back for questions.
Thank you, Roger. And yeah, we will open up. We have about 20, maybe 25 minutes for questions before we move into closing out the meeting. So I welcome questions about my presentation, and I'm sure Roger would welcome questions about the work Projects for Civil Society does as well. Jay, I see your hand.
Yeah, I've been putting together a bunch of today's presentations, and so this is primarily a question for Roger, but any of the speakers could take it. In that, a lot of people in my experience who have had trauma from mass violence incidents, there's a certain amount of that community that then moves away and goes somewhere else to escape the sense of danger. Now, I work in immigration primarily, so I see that on a global level, where it's Rwanda, Boko Haram, but even in my own neighborhood, I've seen people move here from Buffalo or Louisiana where they've seen that violence in person. And so what is being done for those people who intentionally displace themselves and come to Washington State, or what can be done so that they're able to receive those post-trauma services and help reduce the possibility they may be involved in violence in the future, plus also recover from their own trauma?
Well, you're asking you I feel a little on the spot trying to answer that. We try to work through faith communities. We do a fair amount of work in immigration communities too. My experience is that people who relocate, especially on the immigration front, try to find, communities with their brethren, whatever you want to say, people from their region, their country, their tribe, their whatever, clans. So they're still trying to find, a support network, and we use those support networks. We've done some work in the Ethiopian community here, Somali communities, and faith-based organizations are another way through to that. But it is, I think it's more a challenge for the WASPy Anglo folks who go out and, with our epidemic of loneliness and that stuff are disconnected.
And Jay, I think maybe to your question too, in terms of the presenters from the National Mass Violence Center unfortunately had to leave. But maybe if you're thinking about sort of the resources that they talked about kicking in, being available to communities, that's something I could follow up with them What does it look like for people that they were serving? Yeah, maybe they move. How is their continuity? How do they get reconnected to services in that new community? So that's something I can follow up with the National Mass Violence Center to see if they've sort of tracked, people like that and seen if there's been maybe then they've fallen off services in their new community.
Precisely. That'd be fantastic to have information on. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Jay. Any other questions for Roger or myself?
I do, Jamie.
Go ahead, Seth.
Jamie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Are your slides also going to be shared? Because if so, and would you allow us to reuse them because they're super helpful for other presentations?
Yes, they will be shared. I can send them out after this meeting, and then they'll be included in the meeting minutes as well. And yeah, feel free to use them. I'm glad they're helpful.
Great. Thanks.
Any other questions? Thoughts? Well, maybe we'll be giving people some time back in their day. Roger.
Afterthought. I sent out that sheet of a few things. One of my interests has been getting people out of hate groups. And in my time, I've helped 20 to 30 people leave Aryan families, Aryan nations, and life after, get them into life after hate kind of organizations and things. But one of the things that I just wanted to impart on that is that empathy and kindness are the way to get, it's hard to find sometimes, but that's the way to rehabilitate people and pull them out. And I think you may have gotten the sheet already, I don't know, but I sent a sheet of a few links to Jamie. One is a book called Rising Out of Hatred, which is about a former Nazi whose father was the founder of Stormfront, the website for the American Nazi movement. And he was coaxed out of his beliefs. He was attending a college, and they discovered his background. And of course, a lot of people wanted him expelled, and a lot of people wanted him shamed. And a Jewish house of students invited him to Shabbat dinner. And he had dinner with them every week for months and months. And that humanness countered all of his preconceptions and hate. Similarly, there's a video of a fellow neo-Nazi who was, it was kindness of a black woman serving him at McDonald's that started his road to change. And I've got, on the mass violence front, there's also a YouTube link of a fellow who said I was almost a school shooter, and just one active connection interrupted him from his intention. So anyway, I just throw those out there. You take a look at them when you get the chance.
Yes, thank you, Roger. I put them in the chat, so everyone should be able to download them from that, and then I'll be sending that out again after the meeting so that members who aren't able to attend can get it as well. But I think that's a really important thing to know, and I think it ties really well with this group's goals, which is the public health approach, which really emphasizes prevention and not, surveillance or carceral or punitive measures. We have some people agreeing with you that empathy is very critical in the chat. Are there any other questions for Roger? Any last thoughts for the group today?
Just want to thank the presenters. Really great meeting. Thank you for all your good work in the world.
Thank you, Kira. We will pass along that thanks to Elizabeth and Jamison as well. Well, if there's not any other questions, I think we can probably move into next steps in closing, and I can give you all some time back to your day. I just want to close with making a few announcements about some next steps and changes, and the email that we'll be sending out after the meeting will summarize this as well. That the meeting materials included an updated charter that reflects the changes made to both the task force's planned meeting schedule as well as updated protocol or public comment protocol. This group was previously scheduled to meet bi-monthly through the end of this year. However, we're going to be changing our schedule after our next meeting in May. Instead of having the task force meetings in July and November as previously scheduled, we're going to have subcommittees meet instead. This will allow subcommittees to meet at least 2 times before the task force meeting in September. Next meeting, we will talk more in depth about these subcommittees, but just to give you a preview, they are going to be based upon the 4 types of prevention I spoke to today. So primordial prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary. All of the organizations that you represent fit within at least one, if not multiple, areas of prevention. And so in the next week or so, we're going to be sending out a survey to gauge capacity and interests in which ones that you would like to participate in. And then we are anticipating those subcommittees will start late May, early June. Now it's just some administration updates. To streamline communications across the policies, divisions, bodies of work, we have created a new task force email. So after today, you're going to be getting emails from, I'm going to put it in the chat here really quickly because it's a weird thing to write or say out. So that is the email that you are going to be getting notifications about task force meetings going forward. And we're also going to be updating your calendar invitations with the new dates for task force meetings through 2026 from this email as well. Staff have also created a frequently asked questions for the task force and put it on the website to better communicate the task force's goals, what the group does and does not do, to try and make our work more transparent to the public. I'm going to be dropping a link here in the chat to that FAQ sheet, and I will be sending it out in materials after the meeting as well. And this also includes how members can engage, or members of the public can engage with this task force. And finally, the preliminary report to the legislature and the governor will be due June 1st. Staff are in the process of working on the report now and will be giving a preview in May. This report is intended to be educational, similar to how our initial meetings have been. If you have thoughts on what you would want to see in that preliminary report to the legislature and governor, please feel free to reach out to staff and we can discuss. Well, that is all the updates and changes that I had to announce. I will see you all at our next meeting, which is on Friday, May 9th. And the group is going to learn more about community-based frameworks, public health approach, sort of culminate that conversation. We're also going to be having a presentation on constitutional principles so that we can be rooted in those topics before we move into really diving into this work. I encourage all of you, as always, to reach out to staff if you've had additional questions that you've thought of since the meeting that you would like us to reach out to the National Mass Violence Center, or I can also connect with Roger if you have questions about projects for civil society's work. And again, if there's any people who are interested in working with staff on what that May agenda will look like, please feel free to reach out to me. But I'm happy to give you now over 15 minutes back to your day. Please don't hesitate, like I said, if you need anything before that May meeting from staff. But otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Jamie.
Bye, everyone.